Okay, so let's move to lecture 2, the last lecture of the day. So we focused on association testing with dichotomous traits, disease or non-disease, but most traits of interest are not dichotomous, right? Many traits of interest are quantitative, clinical measurements, height, weight, BMI, cholesterol level, systolic blood pressure. So we're going to focus now on introducing approaches for quantitative trait association mapping. So the previous study, we had a dichotomous trait, and we're trying to identify genetic variance that discriminates individuals who have disease or not disease. Here we're going to talk about measurements that cannot be dichotomized, and so they're continuous in nature. And so the field of quantitative genetics is a broad field. There's vast amounts of literature on this topic. There are at least 2 modules, I think 3. So there's QTL Mapping. There's another one. I think Peter Fisher is coming to give a talk as well, a lecture as well on this. I think there are at least 3 modules here on this topic. So there's vast amounts of literature. We cannot cover it in an entire hour, but I'm just going to give you just a basic idea of quantitative trait mapping, and it's pretty similar to logistic regression. We're still doing a regression model, but we're generally going to be using linear regression, okay, where we allow the trait to be continuous. Okay. So QTL mapping, or quantitative trait loci mapping, involves identifying genetic loci that influence the phenotypic variation of a quantitative trait. So in the previous example, we're saying if you have this variant, are you more likely to have the disease or not? Now we're interested in if you have this variant, does it increase your trait value or decrease your trait value some? Okay. So it's the most commonly used for GWAS. And typically, they'll restrict the analysis to variants that have allele frequencies greater than 1 to 5%. Mike is going to cover in more detail on rare variants when you have sequence data, for example, when you have variants that are less than 1% in the population. But for most genome-wide association studies, they're interested in common variants. So with common variants, we can test each marker at a time. If you have rare variants with only 1 person in your sample out of 1,000 has the variant, how are you going to test that, right? There's no power, right, if you just do single variant association tests. So Mike is going to cover how to do some collapsing gene methods where you combine information across a gene or combine rare variants across a gene to do an association testing. But we're going to talk about the common variant setting where we have a variant with at least around 5% of the population has this variant. And that was the idea that actually motivated genome-wide association studies, was that they were interested in common disease. Common disease, common variant. So if the disease is common, let's say a large portion of the population has the disease or the trait, then the premise was most likely the variant that's causing it must also be common. Okay? But there are a lot of rare variants as well. There are more rare variants than common variants. Okay? And so there's a lot of different ways to just disrupt a gene. And so rare variants may explain a lot of the variation that can't be explained by common variants as well. So we'll talk about that in the second half of this module. But now let's talk about genome-wide association studies where we're interested in testing for association with a common variant and a quantitative trait of interest. Okay? So for quantitative traits, there generally is no Mendelian basis for it, right? So there's no, Mendel's laws, where, if you get this particular variant, it's fully penetrant and you have the disease, okay? So most for quantitative traits, most variants actually have low effects, and also there's often interaction between environmental factors as well. Okay, so it's a different world than the Mendelian geneticists. Okay, so influence on a quantitative trait can be due to a number of different things. It can be due to genes, but most traits of interest are complex, right? So it's not just genetic factors, right? There's gene, environment, and then sometimes complex interactions between gene and environment. Okay? And so that's why it's been very difficult to identify these genetic risk factors for a lot of different quantitative traits, because there's so many different environmental factors that are acting on the genes and interacting in such a complicated way that it's difficult to model them. And a lot of times these effect sizes are so small. Okay. So examples of quantitative traits that are complex: blood pressure, cholesterol levels, right? Diet obviously is going to have a huge impact on cholesterol level and blood pressure. But there is some predisposition based upon your genetics as well. Question?
Is the statement that the factors that affect outcomes like rates complex, is it true for qualitative outcomes?
Yes. So a lot of for sure, right? So a lot of times diseases are based upon quantitative measures, right? Where there's some threshold for whether or not you have high blood pressure, diabetes, like all the things. These are often based upon some quantitative measure, and there's some threshold, and if you're past this threshold, then you have the disease. And so you often actually see folks who are in the quantitative genetics world and are doing some work in the binary trait, where they often assume that there's some underlying latent variable that's quantitative that we don't observe, but we observe somebody who has cancer, for example. This person has cancer, right? But they're saying that there may be some underlying quantitative trait, but they cross some threshold that now now they have the disease. Yes. So there's a lot of work on modeling dichotomous traits, assuming there's some underlying quantitative distribution where individuals who have the disease, they have some type of genetic factors that push them over the threshold, and now they're expressing. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. So, but there are a lot of different examples of quantitative traits that are complex. So the classic quantitative genetics model by Ron Fisher was, we have some quantitative trait value, frequency value Y, and then there's some G is a genetic value, E environmental deviation. Okay, so we're just splitting it into two parts, but obviously there's going to be some more complex interaction G by E, and that's a whole different field. Okay, so now let's just talk about let's say we did have an independent environment. We can model the phenotype in such a way where we can separate the genetic from the environmental factors. So what is G, okay, in these models? So G is a combination of all genetic loci that influence your phenotype. So let's talk about height. So height is known to be influenced by thousands of genetic variants, right? But it's the sum of all those variants together, okay, that make up your G value. So some people, we sum all across your genome. Some of your genes or your alleles of these genes are going to increase your height. Some are going to decrease your height. But together, there's some mean value based upon your combined genetic score. Does that make sense? But then there's going to be some environmental factors too, right? So height is not that much, not the great example for height, for environment, because like I said, height is largely genetic. But you could think of something like cholesterol levels, where environment may have a huge impact, where genetics may not have much of an impact, as much impact as the environment. But there's some environmental factors, right? But the idea is some people are going to have some environment that's going to increase their trait value. Some environment is going to decrease their trait value. But on average, the assumption often is that on average, the environment is going to be zero. If we look across our population, some people are going to have an environment that's going to increase it. Some people are going to have an environment that's going to decrease it. But on average, it's going to be zero. So that's one of the major assumptions.
Not under random sampling, is it?
Just in the population. So it's just saying that. So we assume our population is random, right? So, but even if we did, we can standardize the value such that the environment is going to be zero. Okay, so this just says the expectation, the error term, right? So this is what, if we were just to predict your outcome based upon genotype, this can somehow be your error. Sometimes you're going to over-predict, sometimes you're going to under-predict, but on average, your error is going to be zero. Okay? And so what is the error? This could be like environment, residual noise. So essentially, E can be anything that's not genetic. So that's one thing. Environment is difficult to define. What does that mean, environment? Okay, it's hard to find, right? So is it what you're eating? Is it stress level? I mean, it can be anything that's not genetic that may be acting on your outcome. All right? But the mean environmental deviation is generally taken to be 0, such that on average, it's going to be 0. Some people are going to have an environment that's going to be beneficial to them. Some people are going to have an environment that's going to be not going to be beneficial. Diet, for example, is a major environmental factor. Right? Some people are exercising. Some people are not. Some people are dieting, some people are not. But on average, we're assuming that the environmental component is going to have expectation 0. So your best predictive value, your mean value for your trait value is the mean contribution of your genetics. So Fisher modeled the genotype value. So now let's focus on the genetic components. Okay, so the genetic components that are influencing your trait. Okay, so Fisher modeled this using linear regression, and he separated the genetic components into 2 parts. That due to additivity, and that's due to dominance. Okay, so they're saying that if at a particular genetic marker you have two alleles, the effect of that marker you can just sum the effects of those 2 alleles. So you can just add them up. Okay, and then dominance is the part that can't be explained by just adding your allelic effects at a particular marker. So that's dominance, like one allele dominates the other. So we all know what dominance model. Okay, so this idea that Fisher came up with, and so essentially he's saying that you can actually just, no matter what your data is, so let's say, for example, I have a trait of interest, quantitative trait, okay, and this is the mean value of the folks who have the little b genotype. This is the mean value of the folks who have the heterozygous genotype, and this is the mean value for those who are homozygous for the BB genotype. No matter what the data is, we can always fit a linear model. It might be a bad model. We can always fit it, right? No matter how bad, no matter what, we can always fit a bad model. So you can fit a linear model, and the linear model here is assuming additivity, essentially. So we're assuming that, that basically, the model, you have 0 copies of allele, 1 copy of allele, or 2 copies of allele. So things model, and this is the linear regression model. And so these are our predicted mean values. So these are our G's. This is what we predict based upon our model. So this is based on an additive model. What are these right here? What are these errors? I heard it. Or your denominator variance or residual variance. These are deviation from additivity. Obviously, an additive model doesn't fit perfectly to this data, because if it did, where would these points be? Right on there. Okay? So there's deviation from additivity. Okay? So now the issue is that we don't know, is this deviation due to dominance or residual variance, or environmental? All that actually gets clumped into one. It could be dominance and environmental, but these are the estimates, or predicted values, assuming an additive model, additive linear regression model. Okay. So it turns out from the properties of least squares, if you do a linear regression models, that the covariance of your predicted values and your residuals are what? Independent. Okay, so your predicted values are independent of your errors. Okay, so it turns out the covariance between your additive and dominance is equal to 0. So actually, the variance of your genetic factors, which we can decompose into additive and dominance. So additive and then dominance is just the error of your model. So if your model doesn't follow an additive model, then the dominance term is going to be quite big, because the additive portion is not really explaining the data very well. So anyway, the variance of it can be written into 2 parts. And so the variance of your genetic genetic value is equal to the variance of the additive plus the variance of the dominance. So sigma squared A is the additive genetic variance. Okay. So it's genetic variance associated with the average additive effects of the alleles. Okay, so if you give me your data and I know what the effect of each allele is at each marker, I can give you your predicted value just by adding the allelic effects across the markers. It might not be a good estimate, okay, but that would be the additive effect. And then we get the variance of that, okay, from our linear regression model. So sigma squared D is the dominance variance. This is genetic variance associated with dominance effects, which is dominance is deviation from additivity. If it doesn't follow an additive model, then one allele is dominating the other. Okay. So what is heritability? Has everyone heard about heritability? Okay. So once again, I'm saying the variance of my genotypic values, okay, can be written in terms of the variance due to the differences I see due to additive effects, plus the variance is due to dominance effects. Okay. So what is heritability of a trait? So remember now, I have my outcome, my phenotype. I'm breaking it into two parts, genetic and environment. But for the genetic component, I broke it into two parts. One that's due to additive, assuming an additive model that the alleles add up to give me some value. A dominance, that's the error due to an additivity. And then we still have our environment. So the variance component, sigma squared A, is often used to estimate heritability of the trait. So the narrow-sense heritability is written as the variance of A over the variance of Y. Okay. Someone interpret that for me. This ratio. So we know that Y, there's some variability in Y, right?
So it's the variance we've explained by the additive model over the total variance.
Yeah, so it's the proportion, the variability of Y that can be explained by an additive model. Okay? If the additive model perfectly explained the outcome, what would heritability be? 1. You never see that. Okay. So height is like the most heritable trait, and it's like, I think heritability is around 80%. Okay. So they range around that. So some have been higher, some have been lower, but height is basically the most heritable trait. Like the environmental factors have less influence on height, little influence on height. Your genetic factors are largely contributing to your height, which is why hundreds of years ago people were able to predict height based upon the parents' height, okay, which was started the field of quantitative genetics essentially. Okay, so this is the narrow sense heritability. It's the portion of total phenotypic variance that is due to the additive effects. Okay, so another way to think of heritability is the extent to which phenotypes are determined by the alleles transmitted by their parents. Okay, so additivity is important because when your parents pass down an allele to you, they don't pass down both, right? They pass down one of their two alleles, the marker. So it's the allelic effects that are really important. So it's been hard. They've had a hard time actually finding traits that have like strong dominance components, because any dominance component actually gets broken up when a parent passes an allele down to the child. If these two come together, then what gets passed down is going to be random. So that relationship actually gets broken. So I won't say too much more about that, but heritability is the extent to which phenotypes are determined by alleles transmitted by their parents. Dominance assumes one allele dominates the other. So we're talking about looking at two alleles together. If they're additive, I'm just adding the effects of each allele. Okay, regardless of what I have at the other marker, would it, based upon my allelic effect at this mark, the effect of this allele, I can just add it. If I'm dominant, I'm looking at both alleles together. Okay. So any questions about that? Okay, I'm going through heritability pretty fast. Okay. So what is broad sense heritability? So this is narrow sense heritability. So this is also just called heritability. Heritability of a trait. How heritable is it? Okay. Broad sense heritability is dominance and additive together. What proportion of the phenotype can be explained by dominance and additive variance together? Okay. It's hard to get that. okay? Because it's hard to get the dominance part. It's easier to get the additive part because we can just use a linear regression model, okay? The dominance is hard because we do a linear regression model. It's hard to decompose what's due to dominance and what's due to environment. But I just want to let you know that that's the idea behind heritability. It's a portion of phenotypic variance that can be explained by the additive effects of alleles that are passed down from a parent to a child. Okay. So for traits that are heritable, okay, so there's traits with a non-negligible genetic component that contributes to phenotypic variability identifying genetic influence traits. So often you'll see heritability studies done first before they even do any genetic studies. You want to know whether or not a trait is heritable. There is a genetic component even before you even do a study, right? So there's a lot of ways to go about doing that, but you also maybe look at pedigrees, for example, to see people who have high blood pressure, do the children have high blood pressure and so forth. So you need to know before you do a study whether or not it's a genetic trait. And so heritability is one way to do that. So if a trait is heritable, if there are genetic factors that are influencing your trait, then that lets you know that basically, you know, there's a chance of identifying these genetic variants. Okay, so heritability has been a hot topic recently, particularly with the work of Peter Bisher and others, where they're showing that you can estimate heritability from GWAS data. Before, heritability typically was done using families, but with the recent work we're saying you can actually do this with population-based GWAS data. Okay. So how do you do QTL mapping? So let's say we do have a trait that is heritable. Okay. How do we go about identifying the genetic variants that may be influencing the trait? Okay. So linear regression models are commonly used. Okay. So typically, if we have a GWAS, we'll do single SNP association testing as a predictor in the marker and the model, and we use that as a genetic marker. And then we may include other covariates that may be involved in the trait, age, sex, and it's going to be trait specific. Okay. So what kind of analysis can we do? So most analysis will fit an additive model. Right? So we have an outcome, so beta naught plus beta times the number of minor alleles. So this assumes that each time you have a little a allele, that increases your trait value by beta. So, okay. So if you have 0 copies of the little a allele, what is your mean value? Beta naught. If you're heterozygous, then what is your mean value? Beta naught plus beta. If you have 2 copies, this is beta naught plus 2 beta. So we assume that there's an additive relationship, and so each allele increases your trait value by beta under this model. So this is the most common model we use. Other models are possible. Here's a dominant model. Right? So what is this model saying? So that means whether or not you have the heterozygous genotype or the homozygous genotype, the effect is the same. So that's a dominant model. Here's a recessive model here. So up here, just so G is not equal to big A, so there are 2 possibilities, 2 means. If you have 2 copies of the big A allele, then your mean is beta naught. If you have 1 or more copies of the little a allele, then your mean is beta naught plus beta. Recessive model, think of it as opposite of a dominant model. See here, okay. You have 1 copy of the little a allele, then your mean is beta naught plus beta. All other genotypes, mean is beta naught. What other models are possible? Here's a 2-degree of freedom model. So explain this model. So this encompasses all models, right? Because every genotype has their own mean value. So if little a was dominant to big A, what is the relationship between so if I have dominance, tell me what is the relationship between little a dominance, big A? What is this? What is this relationship?
It's the same.
Same, right? Recessive. Then you get a recessive model out of this, right? What about if I have, how do I make this an additive model? B little a is equal to what?
The big and
2. Okay? So this encompasses all models. So why isn't this used often for association testing? I heard somebody. Anybody? Since this question or answer.
Is it like you're overfitting?
No, it's not fit. It's the best fit. You can't do better. No, these other models aren't going to give you a better fit than this model, right? So why would I ever choose this over this? Because this gives us all models, all linear models.
Because each individual doesn't have, or the disease isn't all models.
Okay, expand on that. Yeah, there's some terms. If I'm testing for association, I got to test 2 parameters for association, right? So it's a higher threshold for significance. So it's a 2-degree of freedom model. So here, I only have to test 1. Oops, sorry. Forgot his touch screen. Here, I only have to test 1 parameter. When you start testing multiple parameters, the threshold is higher and you can lose power, particularly in genome-wide associations where significance levels are high and effect sizes are quite low. Okay? So you don't want to test extra parameters if you don't have to. And in most cases, you don't even know the model itself. And typically, an additive model actually works quite well in a lot of different settings. So even if the trait follows a dominant model, the additive model still can pick up a signal. Okay, so the additive model does pretty well in all situations. But if indeed it's a dominant model, then modeling as a dominant model then will give you the highest power. Okay, so this will give us a dominant model. However, you pay a price when you're trying to test for significance because you have to reach a higher significance level because you have 2 parameters that you're testing for association.
So if you do all 3 of those models and see which one, like that seems a
You
little.
got to do 1 model.
Yeah.
This is the model that's typically done for that reason. Because this actually works well in a lot of different settings, recessive, dominant as well. Okay. Okay. So most GWAS are going to perform single SNP association testing with linear regression, assuming an additive model. Okay, so if you have some prior knowledge that something is acting dominantly, then you may gain some power. So I have one of my PhD students actually, one of his dissertation topics was trying to show that maybe we should fit this model, right? And he's showing in some cases you're better off in this model even though you have a higher threshold, okay? But in general, you're not going to know the model. Question?
What's the difference between QTL modeling and GWAS?
So GWAS typically perform QTL. So, right, your GWAS, the goal of GWAS is to identify QTLs, right? So you perform GWAS to identify quantitative trait loci. But we also perform logistic regression for dichotomous traits. We do GWAS with dichotomous traits as well. But QTL is trying to map loci that are associated with a quantitative trait. Okay. Yeah. Question?
Can you do codominant models?
Yes.
So what would that look like for equation?
So this, so a codominant model. So codominant model is when you have more than two alleles, right? Right. So, for example, the ABO blood type, there's codominance, right? So for example, so you do have AO manifest as what? A. So you have AA and AO, for example. I mean, they both get expressed as something. But then you got AB, that's codominant, right? So you have to give them their own effect. Here, both of these can get some of the same effect, beta A. Here, codominant, you got to give A and B. That genotype is on effect because they both get expressed. Okay. All right. All right. So the nice thing about an additive linear regression model is that it has a nice interpretation, as we saw from Fisher's classical example. So the R squared of regression of an additive model actually gives us the proportion of phenotypic variance that's explained by the SNP. It actually gives us the heritability of that SNP, the proportion of variance explained by that SNP. Okay? So another way to think of heritability, so we talked about heritability being the proportion of variance explained of the additive effects over the divided by the variance. Another way to think of heritability is as follows. Let's say we had the situation where we knew every single variant that was involved with our quantitative trait. Let's say we knew it. Okay? If we put all those variants in our model, in an additive model, then the R squared would be this. Does that make sense? So if we had every single variant that's associated or is involved with our trait, that's causal with our trait, and we put it in a linear regression model to predict our quantitative trait, the R squared of the linear regression model would be the heritability, the proportion of variance explained by the additive alleles across the genome that are associated with the trait. Okay, that's another way to think about heritability. So if we knew all of our causal genes, we included all of them in the model to predict outcome, the R squared would be the heritability of that trait. But again, we never know all the genetic variants. That's why we're trying to identify them. Okay? But you can actually estimate heritability without knowing all the genetic variants. And so that's why pedigrees are important, because you can actually assess the proportion of phenotypic variance that can be explained by parents passing down alleles to their children. And so that goes to the question about missing heritability that I'll talk about in a minute. But in any case, if you have a SNP and you're trying to predict outcome from your SNP, let's let X be the number of copies of the reference allele or the minor allele, then in this way, what would our error term be? So error term would just be everything that can't be explained by the additive model, which would include dominance effects and environmental effects. Okay? Does that make sense? So I won't go into too much detail, but essentially you've seen this before, the Armitage trend test in some systems. Now we have phenotype onto genotype. We can test for beta 1 different from 0, testing for association. So people are doing the GWAS, essentially doing 100,000 of these individual single marker tests, testing for association. Question?
So, just going back to the question about the difference between QTL and GWAS. So you are identifying QTL and GWAS, but in QTL mapping, correct me if I'm wrong, you're using typically a mapping population based on a limited number of parents and identifying quantitative trait loci with the traits of those parents that are segregated. Whereas GWAS is
Okay, so there are many ways to do QTL mapping. GWAS is one of them. So you can also do it with pedigrees. Okay, so essentially QTL are just quantitative trait loci. Mapping is just identifying those loci that are influencing your quantitative trait. So there are many ways to do QTL mapping. Okay, and so GWAS, the idea is to identify those QTL. Yeah. So across the entire genome. Exactly. So it's more of an agnostic approach. You're testing everything. You act like I don't know any candidate genes. I have no preconceived idea as far as where these QTL are. I'm testing everything.
And the reason I brought that up is because we, as a company, are trying to release varieties, but a lot of times we don't have time to develop specific populations by QTL. We have to get that over the assets this year. But what about the genome-wide sequencing? We get there a lot further with the markers that we run, fingerprint analysis, wide range.
You want to take that?
I think that's
Okay. So why? Okay. What are you gaining from sequencing except for more testing?
We get there quicker by just simply sequencing, because sequencing is so easy now. We can sequence a large population of individuals a lot quicker than we can by making test process and develop real populations to get into QTL. You see what I'm saying? We have to get to sell those to get a homozygous before we can map the QTL in the population.
It's just cheaper to sequence a bunch of stuff to spend 10
Ah.
So the real, you grow the same gene trait over and over again.
So we have to get, in order to get those individuals homozygous so we can map them,
Ah.
it's 6 years.
What species is this?
Winter wheat.
Okay.
To grow a new organism, but I think fundamentally, when we're talking about QTL mapping here, we're talking about a zero-based context of GWAS. And so for sequencing, it's exactly the same thing. We do QTL mapping within the context of sequencing, but it's basically just genetic association analysis. And the same thing is also true for GWAS. Instead of doing sequencing, you could also actually just run GWAS on all of these samples, and we also refer to that, at least with what we're doing, as QTL mapping.
Right.
So it's just semantic.
Right.
Versus
That answers my question.
Yeah.
Because it allows us to get there a lot quicker. Rather than just very practical situation.
Yeah. Question.
Is this a dichotomous trait or not?
Continuous. Yeah. So this is quantitative QTL. Yeah. So if it's dichotomous, we talked about logistic regression. Yeah. Right. So this is will be your test statistics. For example, if you're trying to test beta 1 from 0, you can do a assumed normality, the t or t squared. You can do a chi-square distribution. Essentially, you're just testing whether or not beta 1. I'm sorry, is different from 0. So this is the effect of having the minor allele on your trait. Okay. All right. So for those who are going to be writing grants, okay, you have to put power calculations in there, right? So you can also calculate power. So essentially, I'm not going to go through it, but let's say, for example, if the variant that's causal or increasing your trait value, decreasing your trait value has frequency p, okay, you can show that the heritability at that SNP, or the portion of variance that's explained by the SNP, can be written as 2p 1 minus p times beta 1 squared. What is my beta 1 here? Interpret the beta 1.
So would that be like significance of it?
Well, not significant. It's the effect. The effect of one allele of type A, where you reference that.
So is the p times 1 minus p such as there or not, right?
No, p times 1p, that's the frequency
Right.
of that
Okay.
variant in your population, right? So
Okay.
that's one. So one thing that we can understand is that heritability is population specific. Okay, so traits that are heritable in one population may not. Certain populations may have a trait other populations may not. Okay, or may be in low frequency. That's because it depends on the frequency of that variant in your population. Frequencies change from population to population. Okay, so that's why certain traits, for example, have a higher prevalence in some populations than others, like they have a higher frequency of the causal variance, which is increasing their trait value or heritability of the trait.
So are you just guessing or assuming what the frequency of your allele would be?
Those are some of the issues, right? Is that a lot of times we don't know what this is.
But this is for common, so it's going to be like above.
Yeah. So you can. So most of the time you're not going to know what the causal variant is, and you're for sure not going to know the effect sizes, right? But typically you say, okay, if it's a common variant, the lower bound I'm going to look at 0.05, right? And then you want to show, for example, what your power is going to be for different effect sizes.
Okay.
So, for example, if your sample size is so small that no matter if you have a high effect size, you're not going to detect anything, then that study is not going to get funded. Okay, so you typically want to show that for reasonable effect sizes, beta, okay, and a sample size of n, and if I use a P of 0.05, I have this amount of power to detect, right? So this, and there's software there to do. I'm just trying to demystify it. They're not doing anything strange. They're just looking at what's the R squared. Assuming an R squared, this is basically the R squared for this regression. Assuming an R squared portion that can be explained by my SNP. Okay, what's my chance of detecting it? Okay, and so I won't go through the details. If you want, if you're inclined to, go through it. But you can calculate power using this formula. You can also calculate what sample size you'll need to detect certain effect sizes. Okay, so you go over 4, right? So if you want to know, if you have a sample you want to say, okay, what's my chance of finding a signal for a given effect size, then you can do it this way. If you want to know what sample size you need to detect a power at a certain level, okay, then this is what you use. Okay, so you can go back for it. There's software that can do that, and this is one of the software packages that you can use for calculating power. Okay. So let's talk about the missing heritability real quickly. So it's a paper in Nature where someone's really scared because they can't find the SNPs that are involved with these different traits. So where did this come from? So essentially, there have been a lot of studies for heritability where they looked at pedigrees and they looked at the proportion of variance that can be explained from the children, from the parents, phenotype. And then the idea was GWAS, as we're covering the entire genome, we'll be able to identify these variants that are involved with these different traits. And but it turns out that a lot of the SNPs that were identified in GWAS weren't very predictive of these outcomes. Okay, and so for example, you had a lot of, for example, these traits that had high heritability measures based upon pedigrees, okay, where you can predict a child's height from the parents quite well, but then when we try to identify the genetic variants that are involved with it, they don't explain much of the. So, for example, at this time there were 40 loci, and on height, only 5% of the variance of height could be explained by these 40 SNPs. Genome-wise significant, p-values 10 to the minus insane. Okay, but when it came to predictive power, 5%. Height is 80% heritable. So what were some of the issues?
Combined effects of different variants.
Small effect sizes, right? So you had to combine it. What else? If you have small effect sizes, what do you need to detect? Huge numbers, example. So there was a recent paper by the GIANT consortium where they're trying to identify variant height that was in Nature Genetics, where they had a sample of over 500,000 people now. They have heights having with GWAS and combined it, and now they're able to, I think they're up to like 60% now. 50% of the variants have been identified, can be explained by GWAS. So for these phenotypes that have small effect sizes, you have no hope of finding anything unless you have large sample size, which was nice in the field of genetics because it actually forced people to collaborate because they weren't finding anything in their own data sets. So for the first time ever, people were covering up their data first, but then like, let's share. You know? And so there's a lot, it actually facilitated a lot of collaborations. That's why you see that a lot of these Nature Genetics papers, they have like 100 authors on them now. Because they have no chance of finding any new loci with their small data set. Their only hope is to combine. Okay.
But then there are other schools who say that we can explain the missing heritability through founder populations.
Hasn't worked. Hasn't worked. I did my thesis on founder population. I did on the Heritability. Yeah, it's just more complex because most founder populations are inbred and there's a lot of bottlenecks. Yeah, so it hasn't worked so far. Yeah. I mean, you really need large samples for these small effects. You can find them for big effects. So, for example, founder populations are really good if you have big effects. Okay, that maybe, for example, if there is a bottleneck in this variant, for example, a lot of times founder population there's a small number in individuals, and so the gene pool is small. And so the frequency may be rare in other populations, but it may be more common in this population. You may have a better chance of finding it because, go back to here, this P may be higher in the founder population. So you have a better chance of finding it than in the general population. But in general, if you're talking about like height and these complex traits that are expected to be influenced by multiple genetic loci with small effects, founder population, you'll never find it. Okay.
Some people speculated that some of this missing heritability is from epigenetic effects.
Yes.
Usually if you've got 80% as a heritability from a pedigree that goes back 1 or 2 generations.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that too. You have any thoughts on that too? Because I know you do a lot of work in epigenetic.
So, some things that we've tried to assess these hypotheses, but at least with regard to a few specific traits, we just haven't found a huge epigenetic effect that's a lot of the effects really, the transgenerational effects are just really independent of the epigenetics. But that may just depend on the particular traits. I haven't done a comprehensive survey.
Is sample size an issue too with epigenetics as much as it is with the GWAS?
Your signal is oftentimes much stronger with epigenetics, so it's usually not as big of a deal.
Okay.
It's certainly still a problem. I mean,
Yeah.
you always need more samples, but it's not a big problem.
Okay, thanks. Okay. So GWAS, they work. So I think Genome Associates have gotten a bad rap because the expectations were too high. Because there was idea that we had the genome-wide data that we're going to be able to find out, but we didn't expect there to be so many SNPs or so many genetic variants with so much small effect sizes. Okay, so it works. If you have a large enough sample, you should just find something. And so here's a figure that shows like what sample size you need. This is in order to detect. So for example, this is you have a sample size of 5,000, which seems to be a lot. You have even if you have 5.5% variance explained, which is hard to find a single variant that explains 0.5% complex trait, you have very low power, less than 40%, even if your sample size is 5,000. Okay? So you really have to have large sample sizes to detect these small effects. And 5,000 seems large. But you really don't have much hope unless you have large sample sizes and combining. You can detect the moderate to large effect sizes quite nicely, but for these small effect sizes, yeah, it's very difficult unless your sample sizes are large enough. Okay, so to finish up, for GWAS, the QTL gene will not be genotyped in a study, right? So I gave you power when you're actually at the QTL. So here we're at QTL, but in general you're not going to be at the QTL. You're going to be at a what? Genetic marker, and your hope is that the marker that you type is in LD or is tagging. the true QTL. Okay? So very rarely you're going to have genotype at the causal variant. Okay? So you're really testing for association because really you don't know what this is, and you're hoping that the marker that you genotype is actually tagging this very well. So here in this equilibrium, you're testing a marker that has no association at all, or is not tagging a marker. So you see the allele 1 at the QTL and allele 1 at the marker are together, but you also see this is the same thing. Allele 2, allele 1 is also with allele 2. So there's no association. Where here, Q1 and N1 always appear together. So you're hoping for the marker that you're testing is tagging or is in high LD with the true causal variant. Does that make sense? Okay.
So let's say we define the marker which is in LV with that QTL. How can I get to the QTL? Is there a statistical analysis, or I have to end up doing functional analysis?
You have to do more. You have to do more. Then a lot of times you do sequencing and then get like narrow the region down and then functional analysis. Yeah. So there's a lot more. Yeah. So GWAS is just a first step if you find something. Right? Okay. So essentially you assume that there's some mutation that occurred in ancestral population, and then it gets passed down from generation to generation, and then so essentially you're hoping that there's some LD here, that some markers in this region are tagging the true causal variant. Okay? And R squared is actually the LD correlation between QTL and the genotype SNP. Okay? So when we're talking about power, we're talking about the R squared of the trait value, the trait and the true causal SNP. But really, the R squared is the correlation between QTL and the genotype SNP, which may not be the causal SNP. So if you're going to do power, you actually have to look at the heritability, but unfortunately I'm saying about the causal SNP, and then the R squared of that. Because R squared measures the LD between the causal SNP and our genotype SNP. So actually, that even makes it even worse because this is always going to be less than 1. All right, so these are some of the issues with QTL mapping and GWAS is that we don't have the true causal SNP. We have SNPs that are in LD. And once again, one thing to think about too is that just like heritability is population specific, so is LD. LD changes from population to population as well. Okay, so when people are often trying to replicate something across populations, a lot of times things don't replicate. Well, it could be because the population you're trying to replicate across population, the population A has the variant, and population B doesn't, or it's low frequency. But it could be that the associated variant is not tagging the true causal variant well in the other population. Okay, because you don't have the true causal variant. You have a variant that's an LD with the true causal variant in your original population. And so these are just things to think about. Okay. So with that, we'll stop, give you we have about 15 minutes. So let's try to do some of the exercises. I don't know if I have time to finish today. So session 2, association test with quantitative traits. Once again, there's R script available to start you off with. So I'll give you 3 minutes, about 10 minutes, about 5 minutes. I'm being stingy. There's a front and back. so read in the data. All right, blood pressure data. All right. So we want to take a look at it. BP data. Just look at the top of it. So we have variables, sex, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, and then we have data on 11 SNPs. We also have BMI measured on the individuals. Okay, so looking at trying to identify SNPs that may be involved with blood pressure. Okay, so create an additive model, but first we need to change the genotypes into count. So we're going to let the sorry, we can't see this very well. Let me extend it a little bit. So we're going to make the T allele be the reference allele. Okay, so now it just makes around the twos, TT, 0 for CC, and 1 for heterozygous. That's what that is there for number 1, where you're looking at SNP3. Okay. So simple linear model right there. And so what is that? Let's look at that model. So what do we have that for additive model, it is significant associated. Right? What proportion of the variance is explained by SNP3 in the additive model?
0.4%.
Not much. R squared. Right? So typically what you'll see for complex traits, not explaining much. Okay. So just to illustrate that you'll get the same results whether or not you chose a T allele to be the reference allele. I'll do here. I'm going to make the C allele be the reference allele. Okay. And so results don't change. So for the additive model, it doesn't matter with the reference allele. For logistic models of the nature, then it does matter. But additive makes no difference. Okay. So obtain a confidence interval for your model. So this conf int default will give you a confidence interval. And so if you wanted to get the confidence interval of your values, then sorry. Let me do it real quick. And here it is. So this is confidence interval of your intercept coefficient and the coefficient for SNP3 allele T. Okay. So you can also easily create a dominant variable, right? So here, a dominant variable here is that if so this is true or true. Any one of these are true. True gets stored in R as value of 1. False gets stored as 0. Okay. So that's or. Yeah. So true. If this is true, if one of these is true, then it gets a value of 1. The source is true. So true or false is true. Question?
So since going back to the additive model, since the confidence interval does contain 1.
So this isn't
Oh,
the odds. So the odds ratio is 1. Yeah, here is 0. Yeah. Okay, so create a dominant variable. Okay, so here we just did a table. So we want all the CCs to be false and all the other two genotypes to be true. So now let's do a linear regression there. Let's do a summary of the dominant. And so 0.024445. Okay. And that, so slightly less significant than an additive model. Okay. So what about a recessive model? You could do the same thing. Here's a recessive model. Okay. So nothing there. What about a 2 degree of freedom model?
So we got significant results on the dominance model, but we didn't get results on the recessive model.
Yeah.
The allele present in the dominant is the same allele present in the recessive because dominant is heterozygous. So how can I get one significant and the other? Or I'm thinking that there will be reference.
Yeah, so for the dominant model, we're saying that if you have one copy of T or two copies of T, they're the same.
Okay.
When the other one, I'm saying if you have one copy of T or no copies of the T, they're the same. So it's so it's either two copies or none, or yeah. So what about the 2 degree of freedom model? Okay. So in this case, any thoughts on why the 2 degree of freedom model we're not getting significance, but we did for the additive? So you're splitting the sample size into smaller pieces now, right? So now, before we just estimated one beta using all the data, so our standard errors were smaller. Now I'm breaking it into different parts, so my standard error is going to be higher for my betas. Okay, so less significance in this study. Does that make sense? So when I'm estimating a entire parameter beta using everybody, then I get more precise estimates, which allows a better signal. Here, when I'm breaking the data into 3 different groups, like this, then there's something here. It's like maybe marginal, but you see it's less than you want to be. And if we did a 2 degree of freedom test, this is if we did a proper test where we would test both of these together equal to 0, then we wouldn't have anything significant at all. So there's a price to pay with this, not only the 2 degree of freedom price, but also you're estimating these parameters with a smaller subset of individuals. All right. So plots real quickly. Here's a plot. Okay, you see it's subtle slope as the number increases, the blood pressure decreases slightly. You're not going to see much for these complex traits. So you can see a little bit better if you jitter it a little bit. So instead of everything looking on one line, it kind of adds a little noise. You kind of spread it out a little bit, right? Instead of everything vertical lines. Same figure, we're just adding some random noise. So you can also do a box plot. Okay. See that some minor increase in stop elevation. So a lot of nice plots you can make with R. These are just some of the basic plots. So question 3, we'll do real quickly. If you want to use all SNPs, you can just add it in the model. Okay. Same as before. Okay. So R squared improved some, as you see. R squared is now 0.02. Okay. But this is a full model. Okay. So now we included. Oh, real quick. What about if you include BMI? Okay. When you include BMI, anything interesting? Okay. Sex is highly significantly associated with BMI. So, but doesn't really improve the association that much, slightly. Okay. But sex, male, female, actually is a strong predictor. Okay. And finally, question: what about if you include all SNPs? What is the R squared? What proportion of variance can be explained when we include all SNPs in the model? Yeah. 0.023. But if you adjust for the fact that you did included all these different predictors, it's 0. All right. Okay. So we'll stop here. Any questions? Okay.
Could you comment on the normalization of the phenotype?
The what?
Normalization of data, how we talking about the statistician
The normalization?
normalization of the phenotype?
Is it, so you want to do a histogram of it?
Yeah.
Is it normally distributed, or I can't remember. What is it? What is it? Okay. Let me see. Histogram, VP data. Yeah, this is approximately normally distributed.
Do every phenotype, like, for example, in doing any type of quantitative analysis, do the phenotype should be like normal distribution?
Yeah, I mean, so you do have to make some assumptions about normality. I mean, so you, like I said, a lot of times you may want to do some type of log transformation of it. I mean, actually, linear regression doesn't really require normality of a phenotype, but if you do have some abnormal, like high skew, then you get some leverage at the point. So yeah, so you do need to think about, some type of like transformation sometimes if you do have some distributions that aren't well behaved. Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's talk offline. Let's talk offline. But there are tons of ways to normalize the phenotype. So, question?
People doing sort of like cross-validation to make sure they're overfitting for one population.
Yeah, so a lot of, like I said, once I said like nature, for example, cross-validation is an replication in an independent data set. You can't get anything published in that way, yeah. But not like the stuff they were doing in machine learning and everything like that in that module. Not as much. I mean, those methods actually don't work, like lasso and stuff they learned, they don't really work well in this setting because these effect sizes are so small.
Okay.
Yeah. So, okay, make sure to download Plink on your computer. We're going to be using Plink tomorrow. The first lecture tomorrow is going to be focused on Plink. I'll have some data that I'll pass around on a memory stick, the huge, that you guys can put on while I'm giving the first lecture. But make sure to download Plink on your computer for tomorrow. Not see you at the reception.